Welcome to Grail Country. Michael has joined me again today. We were supposed to be continuing our series on uh, Owen Barfield's Romanticism Comes of Age. We were going to discuss the essay East and West today, but I worked through my lunch break yesterday and slept too late this morning and only got it about halfway read. So I let us down on my end of the bargain, unfortunately. It's very promising. I'm looking forward to discussing it next week, hopefully. But today we decided we were going to have a conversation instead. Yesterday, Michael linked me a video from an author who is an Eastern European author who apparently does some work as a translator, who's written a book on kind of like not really just on Tolkien, but kind of like on the Inklings broadly. And he was reading a section from his book that was talking about the influence of Owen Barfield's thought on the character of Tom Bombadil in Tolkien. And so this was interesting enough that last night I recorded a conversation with Jordan Daniel Wood and Anthony Baker on Jordan's book, The Whole Mystery of Christ. And I actually brought up Bombadil in that conversation. I don't want to spoil that conversation. It kind of makes sense if you see where I'm coming from. We'll see what people think when they see it in the conversation. But in any case, Bombadil was very much on my mind. And thank you for sharing that with me. And I think we have Wayne to thank for discovering this. Is that right? Okay.
Wayne found it and shared it with me, and yeah.
This guy's got 38. His what that was amazing. And this guy, the fact that he has only 38 subscribers is just like proof positive of what Paul was saying in his video about YouTube not being a meritocracy.
Yeah, but I don't know. It seems like there's something good about things staying small in a certain respect. Like things get to a certain size, and it does seem to become too much of a weight on human beings, where it starts to warp and kind of shape the person in ways that are. I mean, I don't know. Maybe there are ways to avoid that, but it seems almost unavoidable.
If he knew about and were connected to this little corner, he'd have more than 38 subs, right?
No, that's true.
So and this is interesting because there's a way in which like the social networking that is possible through the internet is a way around what the algorithm alone would do, in terms of like I don't think like if you and I had met and we'd started Grill Country and we had no connection to this little corner, I don't think we'd have 1,600 subscribers. I don't think.
Yeah, there's that's a good point.
So I think part of what being part of a larger thing and a larger network kind of like enhances that for sure. So it's kind of a cheat code to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But I'm going to be talking to Evgeny, the writer who made the video. I ordered his book because it's just like it's a gem. It's like he's a really good writer too. I mean, it's not like this is not like some kind of like vanity publication. It's like he's a seriously talented writer and he's very insightful. And
and he's weaving together a lot of threads.
I'm going to put a link to the video in the description for this one so that people can find it. And so hopefully by introducing TLC to Evgeny will get more than 38 subscribers because he deserves to have more than 38 subscribers. So
yeah. Did you watch anything else on his channel? Because I went through.
I didn't have a chance. I was definitely intrigued, and I probably will watch more. Although today I'm going to probably be focused on like mostly thinking about the Grail because Paul invited me to do a live stream tomorrow on the Grail with Jonathan and Richard. So
That's super cool.
So I'm going to go back and take a look at their treatment of the Grail again, and I have to be loaded for bear for that one because I have a strong disagreement with them about the Grail.
What is
So,
it in particular?
well, I mean, in their videos, they what I remember, and maybe I missed something. I'll go back and take this. That's why I'm going to go back and take a look. But in their videos, from my recollection, they mostly just link the Grail to the sacrament, which I don't think is right or adequate. The Grail stories, if it was, there would be no reason to have the Grail stories at all if there was a one-to-one connection with the sacrament.
Yeah.
Like
But
these,
the sacrament
especially
itself is more symbolically pointed to the body of Christ, right?
right, but yeah, right, exactly.
Which does make it something broader than just,
well, I kind of think Bulgakov knocks it out of the park in his Bulgakov and his Grail meditate, but Bulgakov on his exegesis of John 1934. He has this reflection about like how when the blood and water flow from the side of Christ, they fall onto the earth, right? They fall onto the earth, and essentially that like that the earth is transformed, and like
yeah.
the whole creation is transformed, and that this like restored creation itself, it's being restored through the resurrection power of Christ. That is what the Grail is.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's not a sacrament, because the sacraments are always explicitly named by the church, right? It's a mystery.
Right.
So it's something. So the Grail is talking about something that is
But
more than what the church can say, but true. So
yeah.
which is why, and I think there's a connection between the Grail and the divine feminine, which is why the Grail procession is always women, and the person bearing the cup is always a woman. And the divine feminine always has that sort of veiled character about it too.
Yeah. I mean, isn't the Grail, so this kind of connects into the essay that we're going to read. We can maybe weave in some of this as well, because so one of the things that the Barfield makes the point in there is that the whole romantic movement comes about. There's a sort of connecting point between East and West that makes the romantic movement possible. And isn't the origin supposedly of the Grail legend
Right,
some
that's
sort
actually
of
where my mind
connection
went,
with
and it's
the
like, yeah,
Islamic world?
that is one of the theories about why the Grail stories come about when they do, is they come about like in the wake of the crusade. Like the first crusade is in 1098, 1097, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Late 11th century, and then you have the Grail stuff starting to happen in the 12th. So that's a common theory, that there's that this contact between East and West is a condition for the rise of the Grail stories.
Yeah.
I think that, I don't know though, because there's a lot of layers to the Grail material though, so I don't know if I think there's something just too neat and tidy about that.
Yeah.
But certainly it's an element. And I don't think that Barfield's claim that like there's a certain kind of he says romance, right? He actually says romance is what happens when
Mm-hmm.
and I think he has this in mind. He's thinking
But
of because this is the original romances were the works of the troubadours.
right, then that comes out of France, or
Well, not just France, but yeah,
but yeah.
France and German. Well, actually, I just had a conversation with Laura that we decided to redo. She was not happy with it, so we're going to, but we're at some point there will be a conversation that with Laura that will air, that will be on the German romantic tradition, or not romantic, but the German romances.
That
Romance,
so
not romantic.
yeah. Well, yeah, but so that would be interesting to make too. Like, what do you see as the connection between those two things? Like, why do we use that same term? I mean, the troubadours and all these quote unquote romances, like what's the connection between them and what Coleridge, Wordsworth, and
I'd
Shelley
say
and
because they're both
Fichte and
gesturing.
all.
I would say for me, immediately in the context of what we're talking about now, because they're both gesturing toward mystery,
Yeah,
which is why I don't necessarily. I mean, it's like I wanted to
yeah,
hold the essay conversation, which is why I don't necessarily agree with Barfield's point that we need to say how
yeah.
the
Well,
imagination is a truth-bearing property, and that just the assertion of it alone may be enough for me. But maybe that's I mean, I am an incurable romantic. Like that's just who
yeah.
I am. So I'll listen, Mr. Barfield, but I'm not convinced.
Well, so what did you think? So at the beginning, he talks about this. He talks about Carlyle. I don't know who that is, but he writes a history of the French Revolution,
Yeah.
and the big thing in there that Carlyle attributes to the cause of the French Revolution is something he calls victorious analysis.
Yeah, so
Um,
Carlyle is a early 19th century like arch conservative fellow. Um and but that's really like that doesn't really have anything to do with it. Like yeah, what was the phrase again exactly?
victorious
Victorious
analysis,
analysis, right? Yeah, victorious analysis. Okay. Yeah. So right. So
which he so and then Barfield's kind of paraphrases that later as universal and exclusive homage to common sense and to the inductive method of reasoning.
well, I
And he
think
says,
the best way to see the contrast is like to use the example of what he talks about later when he talks about Goethe and the Urphenomenon, and he's and how Goethe says that like if you try to explain something like this, like the blueness of the sky,
mm-hmm,
beyond just an acceptance of the blueness of the sky, you actually obfuscate that there's more to be known by just accepting it and entering into it.
yeah,
So
yeah,
there's more to be learned by just laying on your back in a meadow on a clear day and looking up into the blueness of the sky and experiencing the blueness of the sky to the point where, I mean, ultimately the goal here, that what we're talking about in the imagination, is so that the subject object divide disappears, right?
mm-hmm,
And that so that so that you look up to the blueness of the sky and the experiences of your consciousness is I am that.
right. So I think, yeah, I I find myself so reading all this stuff like that, by and large, like culturally natively in terms of kind of like my conceptions and mental models, I'm still stuck in many modes of sort of materialism, you know.
Yeah.
Even as I look at, even as I find compelling and truthful, like a lot of the things he's talking about, it's still I still like I come at them very from a discursive reasoning, approach of how can I validate this?
So this is what so right. Okay, so here we go. Here we have a difference in temperament between you and I.
Yeah.
That like this is what I was suggesting is why he's insisting on the how. It's like because Barfield wants to let everyone in, right?
Hmm.
He's trying to provide a way in for people who wouldn't necessarily who don't naturally have a way in. And that way in that he's looking for is to say, okay, this is where you failed romantics. It's like yes, yes, but how? Like
Yeah.
how exactly is the imagination a truth-bearing faculty? Like how? And to me, it's just not a question I'm much interested in asking,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know? And I
But you don't think it's necessary for certain types. I mean, we've it's yeah, I don't know. I think you're right in a certain sense. You can only start to doubt your kind of materialistic frame until you see kind of glimmers of light beyond it that just kind of seem more have more of a structure of something you would call real that overwhelms that. But those kind of events are kind of glimmers. It does seem like we have to do something to integrate it into our metaphysics, or else or
Mm.
else or else we can't hold it
Do we need to
together.
do something to integrate our metaphysics, or do we need to integrate it into our life? Because I would say that there actually is that I would actually say
Well,
no, Owen.
I'd say
I
those
would
two
say
things are the
no, Owen.
same.
The Romantics did have an implicit how. Their implicit how was make make things.
But
Be
here's the thing.
creative. Be
I
creative. Be creative not only in your work but in your life.
Here's why I think it matters, because I do think, well, I think those two things are the same, right? Your life and your metaphysics are the same, right?
Yes,
You're going to act out what you believe, one way or
100%.
another.
Right.
But the interesting thing is the power of speech in propositional modes of thinking to actually create realities that you live within. So, I mean, one of the people I still find myself drawn to and listening to, and I'm always curious to hear his opinion on things, because I'm just like, is Sam Harris. And the reason being is that guy like lives in his mental models. Like he has built castles of his reasoning, and everything outside, everything that can't be, like, he's taken it to like the nth degree of his meditations about his own capacity for reason above and beyond any other creature, where like if it doesn't fit within like these clear lines of his reason castle, like it doesn't exist. It like doesn't exist, and you're crazy for insisting that there's anything outside that.
But
And
his
I'm
body, but I think his body would betray him at every turn. Because like there's one thing you can
I'm
do.
sure
You
he
can do that in your head, sure, but your body will tell you that there's something more than that you're lying to yourself, like constantly, if you just actually pay attention to the signals that it's sending you.
Yes, I agree. I'm sure there's like, when he turns off that part of himself, he's consistently acting out narratives that are completely contrary to that he can't see. But then he'll when he goes back into his castle of reason on his
Well, no,
podcast, and
because he's already his axioms have already determined what it is, so that he already has so rather than being in his experience, he has a priori explained his experience. So he's never actually end his experience, except for Sam is weird. This is what makes Sam interesting to me, is he it's weird because that's what he wants to present to the world, but then he has this mode where he like wants to be a mystic, and he wants to be in the experience, and he wants to take the
well,
experience.
I think he knows there's something there that needs to be explained. He dabbles with it, but he wants to come back with his own sort of explanation of it that renders that whole area mute when he hears people kind of claiming to say things that fall outside his castle reasoning. He like, it gives him a saying, "Oh yeah, I explored that. I know what that is." You know, um, but I do think I have heard him, kind of ruminate at times, that where it does seem like he's at the at the limit of almost having his kind of thing, all his propositions kind of burst asunder and like it all fall out. But then he kind of brings it back in and says, this is just, chemicals in my brain kind of, you know,
Mm,
it doesn't have it's not a connection to larger world, which I do think, that's what we're all doing all the time, is we don't well, this comes back to the idea of what language is itself, right? And whether language is sort of arbitrary and sort of random, and just sort of this some sort of evolved from kind of grunting sounds sort of thing, or is it actually um even though it's kind of been, I don't know, marred and kind of twisted for our own uses, for our
Mhm.
own lies and our own, uh whatever you want to call it, in spite of that, it still has within it some sort of seeds
I
of something
agree. I
original.
agree with you. This is like, to me, this is like, this has like, and this is, I was talking about this with Jordan Daniel Wood and Anthony Baker, or Tony. He asked to call him Tony. So Tony Baker last night, and Tony and Jordan and I we're discussing Jordan's book, and I kind of like threw a bit of a monkey wrench into things, because essentially what the dispute that was going on is that Tony was like wanting to maintain participation and the analogia entis as like the importance of them,
Mhm.
and Jordan is pointing toward the inadequacy of participation. So I interjected myself in the conversation at a point in order to bring up Barfield, because I think Barfield's concept of final participation suggests a kind of participation that is hypostatic,
Yeah. Could
which
you
is
steel
what
man hit the
which
point
is
around?
precisely what the evolution of consciousness is about, is to arrive at the point where that kind of like willed participation is possible,
Mhm.
right? So original participation, the consciousness of original participation couldn't have a will participation, because its participation is simply a given, right? The consciousness of withdrawal can't do it, because it doesn't, because participation is receding, and it doesn't see participation as real.
Yeah.
The consciousness
So
of as final participation is the consciousness that's now capable of participating in a completely new mode, in a willed and hypostatic way. And I think actually that was a way of resolving the tension between the way Jordan wants to emphasize the importance of hypostasis, and the way that Anthony or Tony was wanting to maintain the importance of participation. And I think this is language is a part of this. Like Barfield is a philologist. He comes about his ideas through a study of language and delving into the archaeology of words, right?
yeah.
So that's how he comes up with his ideas at all. And we call Christ the Word. And you have this, like, there's like, the Bible has this very, very clear motif where like there's this clear connection between naming and unity,
Mhm.
and naming and hypostasis. And I think that's what it is, like that's what we're called to recover. And that's what I think, like, so part of what the consciousness of final participation is supposed to do is to recover this power of naming, of true speech, of true language.
Right.
And Evgeny, that we kind of started this conversation talking about like Evgeny's video on Tom Bombadil, and he talks in that video about how the Inklings had this sort of shared idea of this like pre-Babel language, right?
Yeah.
And um so um yeah, what do I want to say from that? So yeah, I do think that, like, here's here's what I want to say though. But the thing is that what mode of language is it? And I would say, to turn it back to Tom Bombadil, is I think Tom Bombadil shows us the
Right.
mode, because Tom Bombadil only speaks in rhyme and song. That's how, that is the only language he has. I've been following Ted Joya's Substack, and he's writing on his Substack. He's sharing his new book chapter by chapter, and he's laying out how Western philosophy actually arises out of poetry and music. You have Ian
Mhm.
McGilchrist talking about how um, singing may have been prior to speaking in human beings,
Yeah.
right? So there's a way in which song in particular is like older to us than normal speech. So I
And
think that
I think what is song doing is it's always preserving the unity in the difference. Like,
Right. Right. So the question is like, in order to appropriately, let's use the since this is an example he uses in the chapter, let's talk about the sky. If you want to understand the sky, would it be better to look up into the sky and write a poem about what you experience as you look up into the sky? What, or is it going to be to analyze why precisely the sky is blue and give me a bunch of abstract reasoning to try to explain away the the prime phenomenon
mhm,
and actually just obscure it
right.
and talk about something that no one can experience, right? Because that's what makes it at a remove. It's like that explanation that you give me is not something that anyone can experience.
Right.
So there's an inherent unreality to it. So whatever the scientific explanation of is as why the sky is blue, right? You can give me those words, but those words have no connection to reality. There's no way to experience them. They can only exist as abstractions in your head.
Yeah.
Whereas the poet actually invites you deeper into something you can experience.
Yeah. And the way, I think, where we the problem as moderns that we have is that we relegate our access to the real to the the realm of science. And specifically the way science is done now, it's like you have to be like, you have to have all this specialized equipment. It's not even the science, of like hundreds of years ago where you could go out
Right.
and run experiments in nature and see, like supposedly, Newton watches an apple fall and has his, it's not this personal interaction any longer with the physical world. It's this mediated by technology, and a technology that only special, uh priesthood has access to. They're the only ones that really get to peer into reality. All of us have to kind of sit back and conceptualize if all of our daily experiences as some sort of illusion, that we until we get the word from the high priesthood. At any point they could pinbrick our reality and say, oh, what you experience over here is really
Right.
just ABC
So it's
chemical.
rendering
And
that which
yeah.
is most real, right? It's rendering that which is most real. It's making us think that's illusory.
Mm,
But the fact that the sky is blue is more real than any abstraction that you can tell me about. And actually, you're going to tell me that it's not really blue because blue isn't really a thing,
yeah.
even though my experience of blue is very, very real, much more real than any abstraction you're going to give me to explain it away.
Yeah. What this recalls to my mind is the beginning of DC Schindler's book on love and the postmodern predicament. In the introductory chapters, he talks about Aristotle saying like the thing that distinguishes men from the other animals is our desire to know, but not just in a purely, what we would think of as knowledge, like this sort of crystalline, propositional knowledge, but this sort of experience of reality that, uh, in some senses, primarily comes to us through our senses. So it's like the knowing of, or experiencing like something yellow, and like some yellow silk scarf. There's something in uh, the sensual experience of the thing that we take delight in for its own sake.
Right. Well, and this is the thing, and like where reality happens in the knowing and being known. Like that's what constitutes something being real. Actually,
Right.
Barfield says something about that in this about actually from Aristotle, right? He suggests like this idea that something isn't is simply is is mere potency until it's known.
Right. But what we've
That
done
is
is
actualized in the act of being known.
we've did so in a certain sense, there's this sort of lip service that we pay to, say, what the imagination and the creative impulse and the communing with nature and all these things. But in another sense, we've kind of denuded that of any sort of power by making it, it's sort of superfluous. It's like,
Right, which is why we let it just do anything.
yeah, it's like, um it's fun, it's nice, and we kind of we encourage it, but it's like it's not it's completely separated off to the side from any connection to the truth.
Right.
And that's where the struggle is. I mean, so one of the things that I keep coming, like I keep thinking about in my own self is, I've always had this sort of difficulty with the poetic form,
Mhm.
just because I've always been a reader since, very young age. And, we always had more books than I could ever read, around the house. And, one of the things I can remember is having these huge encyclopedic books they were just like collections of fairy tales and, like really old stuff, like, from all around the world. And I would just go through that. But I remember a lot of it was in, long verse form, for like some old story. And I remember always just skipping over that. I can even remember reading Tolkien and wanting to skip over the Tom Bombadil sections because I was like, oh, I don't like all this
Those are my
poetry
favorite
stuff,
parts.
So it's like, and I know in myself, it's this sort of it's an impatience, right? Because the poetical form is intended to slow you down. It is intended to to stop. You can no longer go at your own pace.
I used
You're
to
now
actually
so
sing those parts out loud to my kids when I read it to my kids, by the way.
yeah. I'm realizing like there's this sort of need to stop, like because a poem to be read rightly, you have to come into the meter and rhythm of the poem, or it's not a poem. Like
But you don't need to force yourself into it though, right?
I think I do.
If you just like, that's the thing. I think some people tend to like overread poetry,
Uh-huh.
right? Whereas if you just read the words and honor the punctuation and the line structure the way it is on the page, if the poet's done his job, it'll come out.
But it's what I think what you have to do and be willing to do is achieve a sort of union between your consciousness and the consciousness of the poet, which is not
Right. Because you won't, because what is not necessarily evident is like what words to emphasize, right? Which is
right.
why a
Well,
poet, listening to a poet read their work always, yeah, there's a way that poetry, I mean, poetry was never meant to just only live on the page.
mhm,
And I think any poet worth a darn knows that, right? Which is
yeah,
this is why poets like record albums of their poetry. This is like Dylan Thomas had like best-selling albums. It's hard to believe that in our time, right? Where
no.
poetry is like
Well,
basically like,
it's
but
fallen. It's
yeah, yeah, like Dylan Thomas had gold records of him reading his poetry. Um Actually at one point I actually had a bunch on vinyl. But you know, and that's something too, because his voice is so unique, right? Have you ever heard a
yeah.
recording of Dylan Thomas reading his own
Uh-uh.
poems?
Uh-uh.
Oh, so he is like, his manner of speaking is so interesting. It's very slow, and the way he plays with breath is just like, yeah, I recommend it. That's
Yeah.
today at some point just listen to a recording of Dylan Thomas. They're all over the place because he did a lot of it, because he actually recorded albums of him reading his poetry. But there's a way in which, like, so poetry, like public readings of poetry, are important
Yeah.
because a poem is never fully alive just on the page.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, for you, you can't
Malcolm
experience it.
Malcolm Guite is definitely a poet who understands this too, because he reads his own poetry so brilliantly, right? And um yeah, just like, yeah, poetry needs to be read out loud. And I would not I mean, and when you're reading poetry, you should be reading it out loud.
Yeah.
I think I feel that way about scripture too, but a lot of scripture is poetry.
Hmm. Well, it's interesting too, like, because I feel like most of the poetry now is incredibly highbrow, um, which in some sense is
Oh, this is an
it's
interesting critique. I like this. Go ahead.
well, because I think it's losing something of what poetry necessarily is. For instance, in this book, Speaker's Meaning by Barfield, he talks about these poles of communication, where you have the accuracy on the one hand, where you like, which could be represented by the most prosaical form, would be like, say, like Cartesian coordinates in space, and then you have fullness of expression. And he and at that and you kind of, to have real understanding and communion between speaker and listener, you have to kind of be balancing these things all the time. If you ever get to one pole or the other, you've lost, you're not communicating really anything any longer, right? And so, but his example at the end of um the fullness of expression, where you're getting too far off in that direction, would be um something like a poet that has an incredible imagination, but isn't able to connect that to his audience. So,
Mm,
like, none of his language or anything is Latin. It's too idiosyncratic to his, the own little sort of crooks and nannies of his imagination and so forth, that it never really lands. And I do feel like a lot of poetry, it attempts to be highbrow. It attempts to show how kind of intricate and wonderful their own consciousness is, rather
mm.
than have this sort of invitation to a collective consciousness that we can commune together. And even some poetry readings, like, I think that they can take that. It's like, I'm going to force my consciousness on yours, and you're going to marvel at my intellect and my abilities and my use of language, etc. But that doesn't, it falls cold. It just doesn't. You might be impressed, but you're not going to have a poetical experience, because, again, I think what poetry is trying to do, it's a union of consciousnesses that
Yeah,
is experienced, um that we don't like, because, in a certain sense, we first of all, we by the scientific method, we're always encouraged to put ourselves in that third person perspective from nowhere. That's where the real juice is. That's where anything valuable, worth sharing, worth commenting on expertly, is derived. And so, but also, there's a sort of vulnerability that comes about whenever we allow any sort of union between ourselves and a thing, right? That
yeah.
we,
And poetry, good poetry is definitely, it's definitely always trying to break the fourth wall.
yeah. And there's a certain, I think another reason we can avoid it is because, in that view from nowhere, we get absolved of, you know a lo- of our own moral responsibility to things, like, because
Mm,
it's kind of like, it's in this sort of like abstract hypothetical, you know playground. um Whereas, when we experience that vulnerability, that is suddenly, when you have an experience that, that I am that, like you were saying, like that Barfield talks about, like, this kind of this, where the subject and object divide are sundered. There, you suddenly are aware of this deep moral responsibility
right,
to
because that
everything.
automatically, the minute you have that realization, it comes with a deep moral responsibility.
Yeah.
Because it's like, because you can no longer just use, you can no longer simply view it as simply an object for your use. You may end up still making something with it, but it won't be, but the way you make it will be different, right?
Yeah.
Where was that? I was oh, was that in the, I was just reading
Is that
something yesterday.
the
Was
the,
that
the
at the
pick stock
beginning?
thing?
Oh, maybe, yeah, that was it. Yeah, that was in, yeah, in Tony's essay on Catherine Pickstock. Yeah, when he talks about like the tree, that's like perfect.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah,
the perfect way of, it's like, yeah, it's like I may still like, make a table from this tree, but it won't be merely because I need a table anymore.
yeah,
And I won't, and it will not merely be made for it will, and I will make it in such a way that it will no longer merely be for use.
yeah,
That's like that's what the like that's why it's important that we make things beautiful. This is actually, you can see like our economy has
yeah,
just like done like beauty is in short supply, right?
yeah,
Not many people's tables these days are beautiful handcrafted works of love that honor the tree they were made from. And that has moral there, that says something, that has something about where we are morally,
yeah,
because of what we were just talking about. Because you can only do that when you see the entire world as nothing more than objects for your use.
yeah. Well, I think the absence of beauty, it contributes to this sort of fragmentation of consciousness.
Mhm.
Because I think that's one of the things beauty does is it gathers up things together. Like it pulls things together. Like, one of like the difference between a room, like say a room that's done beautifully, is like like you feel like everything has connected in purpose, and like there's a, um it's
But then there's also, and it's important to talk about, like, from a Christian perspective here, I think it's important to talk about the way that the cross transforms beauty, right? So in, in the shadow of the cross, beauty is different than it was for the Greeks and the Romans.
mhm,
And so I talked about this a little bit in my conversation with Chris Green, about his book All Things Beautiful. But and I think, as I recall, I think he seemed to agree with me that in some ways, like, um there is something profoundly Christian about what some modern and postmodern art does in trying to elevate that which we don't normally see as beautiful to a position of beauty, because that's what actually
agreed.
what the cross calls us, that's what the cross is calling us to do. Because the cross shows us that like the broken body of Christ is the most beautiful thing that there is.
Yeah. Right. And the reason for that is it's the voluntary aspect.
Because it's done, because right, exactly, because it's like it shows, like it shows the depths of the love, like it's that, like that, the depths of the suffering show the depths of the love that God has for us,
Mhm.
which is why it's beautiful despite the
See,
fact that it's horrifying.
yeah. Well, I think we can work in Barfield here too, right? Because he talks about, how if Christ had never come and stepped on the earth, like he says there's a sort of metaphysical transformation whereby we could never say I in a true sense prior to Christ. Um and so for like the Greeks and Romans you were talking about, like their sense of beauty was always a sort of repetition of nature. Like that was the highest form of beauty, was like to go out there, find the nature and like copy it in some like, you know uh faithful way. But what this sort of possibility of transmuting um our own experiences and the experience of others, even like the most, like you said, the most like ugly, neglected, and sort of seemingly unredeemable aspects of reality, to pull those into that beauty is, yeah, I think that's something that can only be done now that we have this ability to
And it can only be done by
choose.
final participation, because that is not something that is going to just happen. This is
Yeah,
why I keep insisting, like, it's a mistake. It is a mistake to think that we have no role to play in the process of our own redemption.
yeah,
That it's just like that the entire arc of history is just us waiting around for the divine rescue mission. Like, that's
yeah.
not the story.
Agreed.
And God bless you if you think that's the story, but it can't be.
Yeah. Well,
Otherwise, and it can't be, because nothing makes sense if that's the story.
yeah. And what it ultimately means is that nothing you do really matters.
Nothing that has ever been done matters, which draws into question, it's like, that it becomes a huge problem for theodicy.
Yeah.
If none of it mattered at all,
Well,
then why have gone through the whole shit show in the first place?
yeah. See, I think there is a sort of Christian nihilism that precedes the sort of postmodern nihilism, and it is exactly what you described, where like God is so supreme and powerful that like our our decisions don't really have any meaning. Like it's all predetermined in the grand narrative. It's all like, it's going to be resolved by God's way, and it's like it does lead to this sort of like what I do does not matter. It doesn't
Yeah.
it doesn't really affect the final story. Um, which again I think is something Christ is intending to show, is that no, that this sort of voluntary union with the least and the small is somehow these tiny little decisions have like immeasurable impact on the final outcome.
Right. Right. So it's like, yeah, and I think I've been, Joseph, right? So Joseph and I have this long standing kind of like place where I mean, I have the deepest respect and admiration for him. I think he's just he's brilliant, he's kind, he's a wonderful person. But we have this like really fundamental disagreement, and it comes down to like the way he wants to emphasize God's will,
Uh-huh.
and I want to emphasize God's love. But as we're having this conversation, I'm beginning to see the outlines as to how you can't separate those things. And that I don't like, ultimately, like, love itself is has to be seen as a something that's willed. Otherwise, I don't know what you're talking about,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
What could you mean if it's not something that's willed? So I think I would just say that maybe the way to bridge that gap is for us to have, like, maybe I could have a conversation with Joseph and talk about like the connection between God's
Yeah.
will and God's love, because I think that they might be the same thing.
Yeah. Right. Well, and also I think we we have to have some meaningful impact on the final story. Otherwise, we could never participate in that highest good, which is love, which is the willed decision to love. If Because again, it would never we could never have that actual choice of willing to love if it's all predetermined, if it's all kind of the plot's already been written and it's just kind of a matter of things, unplaying, the bad guys play their part and the good guys play their part, and it just kind of happens as it was already written. There's this sort of infinite complexity that that in my mind, has to stretch the workings of God to its limits. Because in a certain sense, again, if creation, if redemption is just a snap of the fingers, let it be. There is no real glory in God for that. I mean, it's like, we don't, like, it'd be like being impressed with you know some athlete that pushes a child over and being like, oh, look how strong the athlete is. No, we have to see the athlete at his, like, stretched to his limits before there's the moment of glory,
Right.
right?
And so this is this is at the core of what the Romantics are really trying to show us, right? And I think maybe Blake, better than any, shows this, is that we're co-creating it
Mhm.
with God. Like,
And I
and
think,
whether we want to, whether like, and we inevitably so, like,
yeah,
we're not just we're more than just we're not just players on the stage.
and for me, that co-creation is what has such high costs for God, to be working with those.
So I've
and,
used
and
this analogy with Grimm before, but it seems appropriate here to, like, just kind of like give a clear, well, not clear, but at least sort of hint toward what I'm saying here. So what I'm suggesting here is that the reality is more like a role-playing game than it is like a novel.
Mhm.
Well, I don't even know if I want to say novel, because we've had this discussion too about the novel, about like, if a well-written novel, the characters have like a very real freedom,
Yeah.
in which, like, the author is, like, in some way bound to respect the genuine
Well,
freedom of a
and
well-written
also
character.
a depth of meaning that you reread the novel, and it's like what the characters did, the significance of it is altered and
Right.
changed over time.
But let's use the stage play, because that was the famous frustration that Shakespeare brings to light, is that, that it's just like, it's a stage play that's already been written, and everyone's just playing the roles that have been written for them, and that's the case. Although, if you've ever acted, like, if you've actually been a player on a stage, even that there's freedom in.
Yeah.
So even that is really not as deterministic as it sounds, if you really get into, if you go deep into it. But a role-playing game, it's more obvious to see where the freedom is, right? Well, unless you have a crappy DM, because, like, I don't when I run a game, I don't determine what the players do.
Yeah.
I just set a situation, and the reality, the world of the game, is something that comes about is in the interaction between the conditions that I've set forth as the DM, and the way the players react to it. And I think that this is, like, that's what reality is, something like that. Like, it's
Yeah.
like, God has kind of established a base set of conditions. He put us in a garden, right? And a lot of what's unfolding is what we're making of it.
Yeah.
And cooperate with we can cooperate with God to make something good and true and beautiful, or we can go our own way to make something that is not good, not true, and not beautiful.
Yeah.
And the imagination is an important tool in doing this. And I think it's like, it's the way we do it. It's like, that's how we can add something of our own to the story that is
Yeah.
creation.
Yeah. And in a certain sense, like, it is all God. But in another sense, we this is where have to get kind of mystical and say that there's something of God in us,
Right,
that
exactly.
that so that, when I say the line that was in some sense written before time, that I kind of, I hit my mark perfectly. In a certain sense, it's not just, I'm not just reading it from the page, I'm also experiencing it as a deep reality with myself, that, like, was already, like, all the conditions that I couldn't have, orchestrated in myself are now, like, aligned to, like, okay, yes, this is not just like, experiencing some external call to do this, but I am in some sense experiencing that external call simultaneously to like a sort of inwardness of, yes, this is right, this is true. And it makes me think too, that essay you shared again by Tony on Pickstock's work, where I guess he talks about the work of why can't I think of his name? Kierkegaard, where he says,
Yeah.
like, to recite a creed sort of mindlessly is paganism. That there is this sort of need now that we, in some sense, we need the ritual, we need the recitation of the thing, but we also have to transmute it. We have to transform it in our own consciousness to something present and united with what we're experiencing now, for it to be a true act of worship.
There was a moment in the conversation last night, I'm just gonna allude to, because I don't want to spoil it, but like there's a point where like Jordan like reflects on the language of the Nicene Creed to illustrate a point he's making about the person of Christ, and you'll have to see that in that conversation. You'll have to wait and see that in that conversation. I don't want to spoil it because it's a good moment, but
Yeah.
it's an example of someone doing exactly what you were just talking about, where it's like he's he's absorbed the creed into himself,
Mm-hmm.
right? He's incorporated the creed into himself, and now he can think about how the creed relates into his work that he's been doing on Maximus. It's like, okay, how does the creed inform what I've been doing here? And he's able to in real time reflect on the creed and give an illustration of exactly how the creed has contained the very thing that he's trying to illuminate all the time. And his job is to to just highlight it,
Yeah.
to call attention to it.
Yeah. And it's always you're doing it right, because there's always a sort of supreme sacrifice involved, which is the giving of oneself. Because again, it's kind of back to that whole thing about the poem, where it's sort of a union of consciousness. It's like it's simultaneously you giving up of yourself, but also kind of discovering that this is like exactly what you want. Ultimately, this is the kind of, it's becoming united to a larger story. And I do think, we don't, we're so caught in this frame of either or, that we always, whenever like these, we talk about these things, it always has to come down on one side or the other, right? It's over here or over there. But I think, again, what Barfield's talking about in this essay as well, east meets west, there's this need for us to pull together and start to see things, to hold this ambiguity together, to unite it.
Right. And it really is deeply connected, as he says at the beginning, as he indicates at the beginning of the chapter, like what this act of imagination is actually directly tied to this ability to recognize I am that. And one of my favorite illustrations of this is actually from T.H. White's The Once and Future King, when the sections where he's talking about how Merlin educates Arthur, right? And the way that and you can see this in the Disney movie The Sword in the Stone represents this. But Merlin educates Arthur by like teaching him this sort of Goethean science, basically, right? Where it's like he's transforming him into animals, right? And so he's not just like observing the hawk. He becomes the hawk, and
Mm-hmm.
and feels what it's like to be the hawk. And this is what the imagination ultimately does, is the imagination is like this faculty that allows us to become the other.
Yeah.
And that's like, and I think it's like it is like, I think it's a primary human responsibility.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of putting it, because that is, I think, what we're ultimately intended to do is we're like become this mediation between the physical and the spiritual
Yeah.
worlds. And we I don't know, it's weird. Like we're in this sort of place where like people always, you find people are always elevating either the physical or the spiritual at the
Mm-hmm.
cost of the other. And but we
That's
don't,
so true.
this mediating role is self-sacrificial, like, because in some sense we lose ourselves in the process. We again, and in losing that self, like when you see yourself in the other, you suddenly have this
But we
incredible
lose
moral
it to get it
responsibility.
back again,
Yeah.
right? We lose it to get it back again. That's like, yeah, like it's a little micro repetition of that great mystery. So I think that's a good net. That idea of losing the self in order to gain it, and its connection to the imagination, I think is a good note to end on.
Yeah.
Because
I
maybe
think
that's
so.
the how. And if that is the how, I don't know, because I didn't finish the essay. We'll have to talk about the actual essay next time when I finish it. But I've read enough other Barfield to suspect that is the how. In which case, yes, Owen. Okay, I do agree with you after all. That is
Yeah.
the how. The how is the willingness to lay down your life. But paradoxically, you don't lose it. You get it back again, and more abundantly.
Yeah. I do think Barfield, maybe like he maybe, I don't know, like in all his work, it doesn't seem like maybe he misses some of that, or like I think he knows it, but he doesn't know how to describe it, or he doesn't describe it in terms, because I think I don't know, the Steiner influence is really interesting, but I think maybe um there's a certain sense in which he avoids, say, like certain classical language, because he feels like that words those words don't work the way they're supposed to anymore, because people have the wrong conceptions attached to them. So he's always
Right,
trying to
right.
burst through with this kind of new terminology, or I'm using this word, but I mean it in this particular way. So I think, but I think that he does a disservice there. Like he would have, in certain sense, some of it could have landed better if he.
Well, but there is like something to be said. Like I get that, because there is like actually, okay, so I was just my the new rector of our church has been showing up to my estuary meetings, and at the last estuary meeting he was talking about like how he's kind of approaches scripture when he's been going back into the book of Matthew, and he's preparing for sermon for sure, and he was talking about how like what he needs to do when he approaches the text is to not allow like his preformed idea of what the meaning of the text is to like distract him,
Right.
right? So he wants to like dig in, get into the original language, and allow it to disclose itself again and fresh.
Yeah.
And I think that is also in the spirit of what, because that's beyond just the idea of objective observation, right? Because then you're like, you're allowing it to enter into you when that's your approach.
Yeah.
So you're not you're not using it anymore. because you can use scripture, right?
Oh yeah.
You can like, I have this ideological notion, and I am going to find all the little parts that match up with my ideological notion, and I'm going to use this scripture as a weapon against my enemies. That's the thing you can do. Or you can try to just let all of your preconceived ideas float away
Yeah.
and come to the
Well,
text and let it present itself to you. I asked him if he ever tried Lectio, but he said it doesn't really work for him. So
yeah. I think it's unfortunate because the mode you just described of using, fragments of scripture to support your specific ideological arguments is probably the chief mode of interaction with scripture that we hear a lot. Again, because in the Protestant revolution, or Reformation rather, like we so much of every movement's identity comes about from its distinguishing itself from whatever branch it broke off from, right? Like, here's where they got it wrong, so I need to make that really clear and proper, because otherwise we don't have an identity as a
well,
body.
because we took authority away from a person, from an embodied person, right? And we gave it to a book.
Yeah.
And I can understand the reasons why the Reformation happened and why they wanted to take the authority away from an embodied person.
Mm.
But to then give the authority to merely to a book was not an adequate replacement.
But it's so interesting though, because I mean, like, you think about the society we live in today, how much that movement of giving the authority to a book, like how transformative that is for our entire civilization that the West is built on, right? I mean, like, this concept of the university and such, and even universal literacy,
Mm-hmm.
like, comes about because of this. Like, it's crazy. Like, it's so transformative, and like, there is, like, obviously there's bad things about it, and there's also good things as well, so it's very interesting, like, um but it does lead to a certain conception of knowledge and what it is, that
Right.
is
But I
tied
would
to the
say that
book.
the trick is to restore authority to the word,
Hmm. Yeah.
which is much more than the text of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. It's in the text, but yeah,
It's
it's
also in the text.
yeah.
You know what I'm saying? The word is not confined only to the pages of the Bible.
Yeah. Well, this makes me think of Barfield's idea that talking about the origin of language is talking about, like, the origin of origin. It's like
Mhm.
it's like a nonsensical thing.
Yeah.
Those two things are, yeah. Um yeah, the word is foundational to all.
Yeah. All right. So I think maybe that will be the note we end up. I hope you have a great day, Michael.
Yeah, you too. It was
Thanks for
great
joining me
talking.
this morning.